System failure in the West and how to solve it. By now, it is obvious to anyone who is actually using the brain that something is profoundly wrong with the leadership and government system in the West. This is especially true of the United States, where real living standards have been declining since the late 1960s, while the country has been almost perpetually at war. In the US, the ruling class has alienated the population to the point that less than 10% of the population trust either Congress or the media. The central cause of the malaise has been a project by a subgroup in the ruling class, the people I call the Khazarian Mafia, to enslave humanity and turn themselves into god-like rulers. The US military and agency white hats have figured this out and have taken action that is being seen in the form of the presidency of Donald Trump. However, Trump has taken over as CEO of a bankrupt entity, and even though he's trying his hardest, he has yet to do what is inevitable and formally declare the United States bankrupt. A bankrupt it is. The US has run a trade deficit with the rest of the world since 1976, resulting in a cumulative trade deficit of over $10 trillion. In addition to that, the US government has $19.1 trillion in debt and has $128 trillion, or 7 times the US's $18 trillion GDP, in unfunded liabilities. That is the real reason why the US corporate government de facto went bankrupt on May 3rd of 2017 when its wholly owned Puerto Rico subsidiary defaulted on its $123 billion in debt. What this means is that no matter how hard Donald Trump tries, he cannot solve the US's problems without first formally declaring bankruptcy. However, bankrupting the US is not the same as bankrupting any other country. For one thing, declaring bankruptcy would make it impossible for the US to keep running its 800 or so US military bases around the world. When this writer first go to Asia to agree 10 years ago to the idea of bankrupting the US military dispatched an agent to explain the US would cut off Asia's supplies of Middle Eastern oil if US finances were cut off. This led to a Mexican standoff that continued for many years. By becoming embroiled in this high-level standoff between the world's most powerful countries, this writer was able to see firsthand who runs the planet Earth. The information below is based on 10 years of meeting with sources in the CIA, the NSA, the P2 Freemason Lodge, MI6, Asian secret societies, etc. Until recently, David Rockefeller was the secret leader of the planet Earth. He was chairman of the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commissions. Furthermore, through various foundations, he also controlled the Fortune 500 corporations. In addition to this, because he was married to an Italian princess, Rockefeller also had enormous influence over the Vatican P2 Freemasons Lodge that controls the Catholic Church and the Mafia. Rockefeller had the power to turn his nephew, Bill Clinton, into president and tried very hard, but failed, to have his daughter, Hillary Clinton, turned into president. If Rockefeller was number 1 in the old power structure, George Bush Sr. was number 2. Bush ran most of the CIA, the $2 trillion a year world narcotics trade, and much of the arms industry. When his son Bush Jr. was elected president in 2000, Sr. was able to eclipse Rockefeller by staging 9/11 and imposing a Nazi regime on the US. Rockefeller was able to regain control in 2008, though, by putting his house-slave Barack Obama into office after the Bush Jr. presidency turned into a disaster. Now, though, Rockefeller's death has created a huge vacuum at the top of the world power, George Bush Sr. has lost support because of widespread disgust at his Nazi-roots genocidal plans. He is also very old and flashes in and out of lucidity, according to sources close to him. So Bush Sr. is no longer number 2 or even number 3 because his Nazi followers no longer consider him to be their father. The Nazis have now made it clear they no longer seek world hegemony. So, the death of Rockefeller and the fall from grace by Bush Sr. means the top level of Western power is now up for grabs. The group that has moved to fill the vacuum in the US has been the Gnostic Illuminati, the group that opposes bloodline rule and claims credit for the French, US, and Russian revolutions. They have led a purge at his level bloodline servants in the US that is nearing completion. At the same time, invigorated by the fall of their upstart US rivals, the European bloodline families have made a big push to filling the Rockefeller-Bush vacuum. Their top people are Queen Elizabeth, Pope Francis, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The Europeans were able to come very close to using their fake carbon cost global warming scheme to implement the Paris Accords. This would have created a world government still controlled by them, but with a greater seat at the table for the Chinese. The power of this group was evident at the G20 meeting in the early July, when 19 out of the 20 so-called world leaders expressed support for the scam. However, without the support from the Gnostic Illuminati and without any scientific basis, this carbon scam is doomed to fail. The Gnostic Illuminati control both the Trump presidencies and the US military-industrial complex and are using their agents to attack bloodline rule in Europe now that their push in the US is more or less complete. Right now, though, there's a standoff in the West between the European royal bloodlines represented by the Pope, the Queen, and Merkel, the Gnostic Illuminati represented by Trump. Meanwhile, in Asia, China has now built up alternative energy import networks so that it can continue to operate even if all Middle Eastern oil supplies were cut off. The Asian alliance also managed to co-opt Europe into joining its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and its massive One Belt, One Road public world initiative. The Chinese have further made huge inroads in Africa and other developing countries with their generous infrastructure work. Most of all, the Chinese are the main creditors to the US and could bankrupt them if they chose to do so. Of course, the US still has its Star World War III card to play, but using that card will lead to the destruction of the planet. So the US side is trying to get the Russians to join them in a Christian white alliance. To entice the Russians, the Americans have ceded to them hegemony over Europe, minus the UK, as well as half of the Middle East. The US side also still has control over Japan and the Korean peninsula, including its pet rogue state North Korea. The Americans are also assiduously courting India. The overall result is that there still exists a Mexican standoff between East and West. The key battleground this fall is expected to be Japan. It is money from Japan's postal savings, agricultural bank, pension funds, etc. that is keeping the US barely solvent. However, the puppet government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has less than 10% support in real public opinion. There is also incredible resentment and anger at the Korean agents used by the US occupation authorities to control Japan since the end of World War II. As shown by the result of the June Tokyo regional elections, the long-term ruling puppet Liberal Democratic Party is certain to be wiped out in the next general election. The White Dragon Society is pushing hard for regime change in Japan as early as this fall. The aim is to force real regime change in the US, because Donald Trump's presidency is too little too late. What is needed is a formal declaration of bankruptcy in the US so as to jumpstart a complete revamp of the international architecture put in place after World War II so as to better reflect current world demographic and economic reality. The WDS also believes the world needs a minimum common set of rules so that international criminals like the Khazarian Mafia can no longer engage in illegal wars, looting, and other antisocial activities. The WDS further believes benign symbolic bloodline rule in the West and Asia can coexist with meritocracy. The WDS also supports initiating a new golden age by starting with a jubilee, a one-off redistribution of assets, a massive campaign to clean up the planet, and a systematic effort to expand into the universe. A new calendar to replace the Western-centric one now in place would also help start a new age.